Welcome to the Retirement Made Easy podcast. I'm your host, Greg Gonzalez. My goal for the podcast is to help you live a better life in retirement by giving you the tools and information you need in a language that you can understand. Today's episode, what do you do when you inherit your mom's IRA? So far this year, I've had a few clients that have inherited their mom's IRA, and it's a big question mark. What do they do with it? How are they going to be taxed? So on today's episode, we're going to talk about that. What happens when you inherit your mom's IRA? We're going to talk about that and more on today's episode. Before we get into the meat and potatoes, I wanted to remind listeners to check out our website, which is retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. That's retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. There you can listen to past episodes. You can also download a lot of free resources that will help you out, such as our 2020 tax planning guide, and you'll definitely want to check that out as well. The Retirement Made Easy podcast comes out every Thursday morning, so you'll want to subscribe and check us out every week. While you're on the website, at the very bottom, there's a section that's called Ask Greg a Question. You can submit your question right there, and I'll be happy to get back with you within 24 hours. Love to hear listener questions, and maybe I'll even use your question on a future podcast episode. All right, let's get into today's content. What do you do when you inherit your mom's IRA? Well, a lot has changed so far this year in 2020. There was a law that went into effect on January 1st of 2020. It's called the Secure Act, and the Secure Act really changed the rules for someone that inherits an IRA. I encourage you to check out my website, retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. Under resources, you'll find a summary that I wrote about the Secure Act and all of its implications. But let's start from the very beginning. Let's say your mother passes away and you have this IRA statement that's on her kitchen counter, and you're listed as the beneficiary, or you assume that you are listed as mom's beneficiary. So what you would do is you would contact the custodian of the IRA. Let's say it's Fidelity or Charles Schwab, whatever name is on the top of the statement. You would call the 800 number and you would tell them, hey, look, my mom passed away. What are my next steps as far as inheriting this IRA account from my mom? And they would say, probably they're going to tell you, you need to fill out X, Y, and Z forms and submit them to us with a copy of the death certificate. So whenever mom or dad passes away, I always recommend, and it could be anybody in your family that, let's say, passes away, I always recommend getting a few extra copies of the death certificate. I know it costs a couple extra bucks, but you're probably going to need it. So you submit your paperwork to the custodian, we'll call it Fidelity or Charles Schwab, and they will open a inherited IRA, what's called as a beneficiary IRA, and it will be in your name. You inherit it from mom, and then at that point, the assets will transfer from your mom's IRA to your own IRA. While you're filling out the application paperwork, be absolutely sure that you're putting in beneficiaries for your account. Heaven forbid something happens to you. You want that money, those assets, to go to the next generation or whoever you designate as a beneficiary. Now, sometimes these forms can be tricky and they can be a pain in the neck. So if you're currently working with a financial advisor, I would contact them and get their help. As financial advisors, we deal with this on a very frequent basis. So we're very familiar with the forms and the paperwork that's needed and how to process it properly. Oftentimes, the paperwork will require a medallion signature guarantee or a notary stamp, and so your financial advisor will, of course, be able to help you with that. Or you can go to the bank and get it notarized as well. The paperwork will be a little cumbersome, but once it's set up, now you'll have your account, your inherited or beneficiary IRA is what it's called. And then at this point, you'll be able to invest this account however you decide. I'm going to assume that maybe your mother's financial goals were different than yours. So your mother may have had this account invested in a way that suited her goals, but will not necessarily suit your goals. So that's another thing that you can do is you can, since it's in an IRA, you can switch the investments, change the investments to suit your needs and your goals. And there won't be any tax consequences of selling or buying any investment, again, because it's in an IRA, which is all pre-tax money. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be thinking to yourself, what if I wanted to take a withdrawal from this account? Maybe you had some debt that you wanted to pay down and use this account to do so. That's perfectly acceptable. You can absolutely do that. Just realize that you're going to pay ordinary income taxes on withdrawals from this IRA. Just like you were taking it out of your own IRA, you would pay taxes on it. Now, the cool thing is with inherited IRAs, if you're under 59 and a half, that 10% penalty, early withdrawal penalty, does not apply. So if you're 58 years old, you inherit mom's IRA, you could take withdrawals out of your now inherited IRA from mom. Even though you're under 59 and a half, you don't have to pay that 10% penalty. However, if you took money out of your own IRA, you're under 59 and a half, you would have a 10% early withdrawal penalty. Now let's talk about the Secure Act, because the way it used to work, if you inherited mom's IRA in 2019, December 31st, 2019, or prior to that, you would have what's called a stretch IRA, which means you would have required minimum distributions that you had to take from this inherited or beneficiary IRA over the course of your lifetime. And it would depend on not only the account value, but also your age. And that was called what was called a stretch IRA. You could stretch that account over your entire life, and then you would have these minimum required distributions that you would be forced to take money out. It may be 3 or 4%, depending on your age. It could be even a lot higher. So that was a way of keeping that inherited IRA alive for your lifetime if you're just taking the minimum distributions. However, that all changed with the passage of the Secure Act. So now, let's say you inherit mom's IRA in 2020, there's no stretch IRA. So there's no ability to stretch this account over your entire lifespan. Now the rule is really quite simple. You have 10 years to take all the money out of the account and pay the taxes on it. So let's say it's $100,000. Theoretically, you could take 10% per year, $10,000 per year, and then at the end of the 10th year, anything that's left over the $10,000, you would be required to take out of there. You could do it any way you wanted. You could, for 5 years, not take any withdrawals out of this inherited IRA, and then in the last 5 years, you would deplete the account totally. You could take it all out in the first year. You could take it all out in the 10th year if you wanted. It's really up to you, your financial advisor, maybe your tax planner, CPA, of how you want to go about taking these distributions from your IRA and what strategy makes most sense to you and your retirement plan. We had an instance where someone was retiring in 3 years, and so their taxable income was going to go way down at the end of this 3 years now that they were retiring. So when they inherited an IRA this year, they were going to wait 3 years to start taking distributions from this inherited IRA. That's something that their CPA recommended, and I definitely agreed with wholeheartedly. So your situation is going to dictate what makes most sense as far as the strategy you come up with to get that money out of your inherited IRA over the next 10 years. In this hypothetical example, again, I'm assuming it's your mother's IRA and that you inherited this IRA in 2020 or later. So the Secure Act 10-year rule applies to this. And certainly inheriting an IRA from your mom is going to help your own retirement plan because it brings more resources to the table that you can potentially draw from and have access to as capital. Like I mentioned, inheriting mom's IRA may allow you to pay off your home earlier or other debt that you might have, like car loans, credit cards, things of that nature. One question that I got from a client recently was in regards to inheriting mom's Roth IRA. Again, the same 10-year rule would apply that was given to us by the Secure Act. So in a Roth IRA sense, you have 10 years, just like a regular IRA, to distribute or withdraw the money from that inherited Roth IRA. And again, with the Roth IRA, any withdrawals or distributions that you take out of your inherited Roth IRA are going to be absolutely tax-free, as opposed to the IRA, where you're going to have distributions that are taxed as ordinary income. If today I inherited my own mother's Roth IRA, I would be inclined personally to let it grow for the next 10 years tax-free, and then at the end of the 10th year, take a big distribution, totally empty out the account, knowing that giving it 10 years to grow tax-free, the size of the account is going to be probably quite large, and any distribution I take out of the Roth IRA, the inherited Roth IRA, rather, is going to be 100% tax-free at that time. For your own strategy, I would certainly check with your financial planner and possibly even your tax planner, so you can come up with your own strategy that makes sense for your situation. Certainly the size of mom's IRA that you're inheriting is going to be a factor. Also, the other resources that you have, your household taxable income is going to be a factor. Whether you're retired or not is another factor. And also, what your plans were to do with this money when you do take it out of your inherited IRA. Are you going to pay down debt with it? Are you going to go on a trip? Are you going to use it to fund children or grandchildren's college education? So that's certainly important. What would you do with the money should you take it out of the inherited Roth IRA or IRA? And really, what's the best plan of action? Let me give you an example of a client we were working with earlier this year with the help of his CPA, his tax planner. This gentleman inherited his mom's IRA. He didn't need the money to pay off any debt, and he wanted this money to grow tax deferred, but he knew he had to distribute the money in 10 years. Well, it just so happened that he was planning on working for another 10 years. He was also self-employed. And so the three of us put our heads together, and what we decided was he would take a lump sum for the next 10 years out of the inherited IRA and pay the taxes on it, and then he would contribute to his SEP IRA in the exact same amount of his distribution from his inherited IRA from his mother. So essentially, it was a tax wash because he was getting the tax deduction going into the SEP IRA, and the money coming out of his inherited IRA from his mother was being taxed, so it was a complete wash. No tax liability. And assuming that he works like he's planning to for the next 10 years, this is a perfect solution for him. His big concern was the fact that he was under 59 and a half. He didn't want to pay that 10% early withdrawal penalty when you take an early withdrawal from IRAs when you're under 59 and a half. But we quickly reminded him that that 10% penalty will not apply to early distributions from inherited IRAs. So inherited IRAs, again, that will never apply, that 10% early withdrawal penalty. You could be age 40 and take a distribution from your inherited IRA, and you will never pay that 10% early withdrawal penalty. So that put his mind at ease. I would encourage anyone out there who does inherit mom's IRA to come up with their own strategy that's going to work for them. One important factor to note is that most people that inherit mom's IRA, in this hypothetical example, most likely will inherit other assets as well. Let's say it's a bank account, like a checking account, savings account. Maybe mom had some CDs. Also, maybe you sold mom's house. So there may be other assets at play here that need to go into the overall picture and what you do with those assets as well. But as far as the IRA, that is the particular account that we're talking about on today's podcast. And what's nice about the IRA is as long as your mother listed beneficiaries, maybe listed you or one of your siblings as her beneficiaries, this account will not go through probate If my mother listed me as the sole beneficiary of her IRA, I can contact the custodian of my mom's IRA. I can provide them the paperwork that they require to inherit my mom's IRA, provide them a copy of the death certificate, and it can be all worked through them without ever having to go through probate or any of that mess. Remember, the custodian of my mom's IRA is used to dealing with this on a daily basis, so this is nothing new to them. As long as I complete the paperwork that they require properly, my inherited IRA from my mom will be set up and established in a timely fashion, and I'll never have to go through probate or have to deal with all the headaches that come with the probate court and its whole process. The last thing that I wanted to mention when it comes to inheriting mom's IRA is you can't transfer or move mom's IRA into your own IRA. You have to keep them separate because the beneficiary IRA or the inherited IRA that you get from your mom will have its own account number and needs to be kept separate from your IRA because that's how we track that 10 years that you have to get the money out of this inherited or beneficiary IRA that you got from your mom. You've got 10 years to get the money out of there, and if you merged it with your own, that would be a whole mess. So you got to keep them separate. I know it's another account to keep track of, but you got to keep them separate. Believe me, I have clients that have their own Roth IRA, their own IRA, and then an inherited Roth IRA, and then an inherited IRA, both of which they got when their mother passed away. So they have 4 accounts in total, and we have to keep them all separate like that. I hope today's episode has kind of cleared up some of the fuzziness with what happens if you inherit mom's IRA, or maybe it was a Roth IRA. But again, if you have questions, you can go to my website, which is retirementmadeeasypodcast.com. At the bottom, there's Ask Greg a Question. So if you have a question about your own situation, you can ask away. I'll be happy to get back with you within 24 to 48 hours. And again, thanks for listening to the Retirement Made Easy podcast. Again, I'm your host, Greg Gonzalez. You can catch my next episode next Thursday. And remember, always dream big. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, please consult your attorney, tax advisor, or financial advisor prior to investing. This is a hypothetical example and is not representative of any specific investment. Your results may vary. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices mentioned are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. The SmartVestor program is a directory of investment professionals. Neither Dave Ramsey nor SmartVestor are affiliates of St. Louis Retirement Advisors or LPL Financial. There is no guarantee that a diversified portfolio will enhance overall returns or outperform a non-diversified portfolio. Diversification does not protect against market risk. All investing involves risk, including loss of principal. No strategy assures success or protects against loss. Securities and advisory services offered through LPL Financial, a registered investment advisor, member FINRA, SIPC.